Hi, welcome to my YouTube channel and this video. Today we're going to do a walkthrough on Lightroom. The images that we're going to look at today are of Twr Mawr Lighthouse in Anglesey. Now we've got this image on screen which at first glance doesn't seem too bad, but the main concern that I've got is the definition here in the background. Yeah. The rocks just don't look right at all. Now obviously we've got a lighting issue here, it looks pretty dull. That's just because I've taken this image as an example of what I'm not happy with as regards a couple of photographs that came out. I'm not happy with this definition here. So this is a finished image of the same lighthouse. Obviously the lighting is better. And we do have a wee bit of lens flare here, but I actually like the image. But the reason that I'm pointing this out is because if we look at the definition of the rocks here, yeah, that's proper definition there. And what we've done is we've lost the definition on this image. So even though the dynamic range of the D800E is awesome, it's obviously not been good enough to pick up the definition and the contrast in these areas here in comparison to this image, where we can obviously see that the contrast here is really good on the rocks on the right hand side, but more specifically for me, the rocks here on the left hand side. So what we're going to do is we're not going to work with this image here. That's a finished image for me and I'm happy with it. But I'm just going to go through or do a walkthrough of how I get from an image with not much dynamic range there to an image like this with two different photographs. Now I'm sure people who are more adept at Lightroom than me will already realize the best way to go about this, but for people who wonder how you get this dynamic range, particularly with cameras that maybe don't have a great dynamic range, this walkthrough may be beneficial for you. So I'm going to show you the two images that we've picked, and that's one image. Now let's ignore this because it's just more for walkthrough purposes. We could have maybe got a better image of the sun for this shot, but what we're looking at here is good exposure of the sky, and I'm not worried about the foreground. If we look at the histogram here on the left hand side, what we can see is that the blacks are pushed way over to the left hand side, and that corresponds with what we're seeing in the image. But what I'm interested in is here on the right. We've not blown out the highlights or the whites on the right hand side. So if we now go to the second image that we're going to use to blend these two together, what we can see is on the left hand side the blacks are not blown out to the left, so we know that we're not going to get any very black points within the image. But what we've unfortunately got, which doesn't really matter, is blown out whites or highlights to the right hand side. But what we're going to do is we're going to take these two images and we're going to blend them together in Lightroom to produce a so-called HDR or high dynamic range image. Now, high dynamic range, if done incorrectly, for me personally, and other people may disagree, but it can make images look really quite false. And I think that maybe if we take multiple images and then start to mess around with saturation and everything afterwards, we can really make them not look real. And what I want to do, and what I try and do with most of my images, is keep the images as real to life as possible. So what we've done is we've highlighted the two images by pressing the Command key and bringing them both together. We're going to go up into Photo, Photo Merge, HDR. And the options that we've set will always be Auto Align, because there will be a differentiation sometimes between the two shots. Also Auto Tone, and finally Deghost set to high. And we now have the HDR merge preview, which looks pretty good. So we will say merge. Okay, we've let Lightroom do its thing. Click on the new image and let it load up. So if we compare the new image with the first image that we showed by highlighting them and pressing C on the keyboard, what we can see is that the range here on the right hand side compared to this one is a lot worse, but more importantly for me is the rocks here at the back compared to the rocks here at the back. Now this one has already had quite a bit of work done on it in Lightroom, and for me it still looks a lot worse than this one that's not had anything done other than blending the two images together. So if we just come out of compare mode, now this is our HDR image. What we're going to do now is just go through the walkthrough of how to enhance the image. As I mentioned before, I don't try and go overboard with this process, maybe because I'm not as technically minded as some people, but I like to keep the image as natural as possible. So neither of the two original images had any post-processing work done to them. This is possibly a different workthrough compared to Photoshop, as with Photoshop you really need to do your post-processing prior to sending it into Photoshop, because when you get your file back it will no longer be a raw file, but this isn't a problem in our case, so we could just treat this as an original raw file. First of all, I'm going to enable profile corrections and remove chromatic aberration. Next I'm going to have a look at my white balance. With white balance I shoot in either cloudy or daylight mode, but it doesn't concern me particularly because when I come into post-production I can change it. Normally what I will do is click on the white balance eyedropper and come to a neutral grey tone, which that will do for me, and we click it and it just changes the white balance of the image. Now it was only a week or two ago that I was at Llanddwyn Island, and I do remember that the overall tone was more of a magenta hue, and that's what this image is showing me here with the white balance, so I'm happy with that. Next thing I do is I will go down to camera calibration and I will click camera landscape. What I often find with camera landscape, it just brings all the colours out a little bit more vibrantly and the images don't look fake or overly processed, and I'm going to stick with camera landscape with this picture. So what you will notice is once you have blended the two images together, you will find that Lightroom will have changed some of the sliders here to optimize the image, but often you'll find that a little bit of tweaking down here will improve the overall feeling of the shot. So what I'm going to do first of all, because in my images I like punchy contrast, is I'm going to bring the contrast up to 30, and already we can see that the image starts to pop out at you, which I really like. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to alter the whites setting by holding down the Alt key and looking at what is blown out with the whites, and we can see that the sun is, so I'm just going to bring that back a little bit. I'm not too concerned that we've got some whites blown out for purposes of this walkthrough, and let Lightroom do its thing. And now what we're seeing is we're seeing more of a moody feel to the actual shot, so that has actually improved things, because don't forget the sun was setting at this point. It wasn't directly below the horizon, it's here, but it's low in the sky, and altering the whites has just made things feel a little bit more moody, a little bit darker, which I really like. So now we're going to go and look at our blacks. Now I do like to drop the blacks down, so we've got room to do that with this shot, and I don't mind if some blacks start to pop through, but not too much. That will do me. Okay, now I think that's a little bit too much, so I am going to take it back a little bit. Okay, that's better. So Lightroom has done quite a good job with the shadows and done quite a good job with the highlights. Now, from what I remember, the overall feeling of the light was it was a tad warmer than what we can see on this image. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to play with the temperature. If we take the temperature to the left, we get cold image. But what I'm going to do is just bring the slider slowly up to the right. And we're going to leave that about there. It just warms the image up just a little bit. And then it was slightly more magenta, even though changing the white balance with the eyedropper did a good job. We're just going to get a little bit more magenta into the image. And what I'm looking at here is I'm looking at the beach. It's a little bit too much, so that looks good. Now I'll come back to this in a little while, but obviously down here we have presence. Some people like to really saturate their images, such as that, and for me I don't like that at all. If I ever do anything, I'll actually a tad undersaturate, but that's not what I'm after in this case because I want to glow from the shot, so I'm just going to leave the saturation as it is. Also, people will add clarity. If I add clarity, I'll go to a maximum of 10. And so what I'm going to do here is suck it and see what it looks like with improved clarity or increased clarity. Yeah, and that actually looks quite nice. So I'm going to leave the clarity at 10. And if we have a look at our vibrance, again, our maximum I'll go to is 10. That hasn't had any detrimental effect on the image at all, so I will leave the vibrance at 10. It's rare I actually put vibrance or clarity in, but in this case it has created more of a pop to the image, which I like. And I hope that everybody who's watching this will agree, but if we actually look at the image doesn't look, for me, fake at all. All we're doing is enhancing what was there already. Now, I will come back to these in a wee while, but I'm going to leave them as is for now. As regards changing HSL colour, hue, saturation and luminance, I'm not going to touch it at all. What I'm going to do there is I'm going to start messing with an image that I want to be as natural as possible. So I don't want to highlight these greens because that's the greens that I saw when I took the picture. So I'm going to come down to sharpening. Now the D800E is a very sharp camera, but I like to take my sharpening up to 70. Matter of habit, because it really does make the image pop. And we go to radius and 1.5 out of habit. And finally, we don't want sharp sky, so if we hold the Alt button and with the masking, take it up to around 50%. And what we should say at 50% is the areas in black aren't being sharpened. Okay, now add a wee bit of noise reduction under the luminous slider, and I normally bring that up to around 30, and bring the colour to the right to about 70. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to go up to the crop tool. Not going to mess around with this image much at all as regards crop, but there's a couple of things I don't like. Number one, we do have lens flare here on the right hand side, which makes these rocks look a little bit mushy. We're going to have that anyway with this image, but I am going to bring this across, take this rock out of the equation, and what I'm doing is as I'm cropping, I'm looking down here to make sure that it looks relatively natural for the crop. And the other thing I'm going to do as a matter of composition is rule of thirds and bring the horizon up, so we have the horizon on the top third. Now the other thing that we can see is that we're a bit cockeyed as regards the horizon, so we'll click angle, we'll just follow the line of the horizon there, click that, and that's bringing it up. It looks a wee bit straighter. I think we'll do a little bit more to that. So I quite like this composition. Now if we look here again, it's not perfect, is it? I could, if I wanted to, take that out of the equation completely to something like that, and then bring this side in, and there is a a pretty famous picture of this lighthouse, which is cropped to something like that, yeah, which is a nice shot in itself. But for the purposes of this walkthrough, I'm really not fussed about doing that. So we'll go back to the original crop that we did. Now, what I need to do is I want to emphasize the sky. So we will take our graduated filter, and I'm going to use a couple of graduated filters here. One on this side, one on this side, and maybe a radial filter here. So this has brought a little bit more of the sky out, and we've also got some sun rays here, which is nice. I'm going to drop the exposure down just a tad, not too much. That's perfect. And I want to improve the magenta tint here. So I'm going to increase magenta to 10. We may go a little bit further actually. And what I often do is you can lose sight of it here, whether or not it looks right or wrong. So I'll often go over here and have a look and see what it looks like on this image on the left hand side, and it doesn't look too bad. I'm going to just warm this corner up a little bit, and that looks good there. As the filter graduates down, what we've got is we've got a nice change in the reflection here. Because the graduated filter also goes over the top here, you will get subtle changes in the lighting on the lighthouse, and that's why I brought it over onto the lighthouse here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate this filter, and we're going to take that duplicated filter over to the left hand side to there, and I'm going to increase the magenta a little bit in the corner on this side, and we can just see subtle changes of the clouds here on the left. And on this side we're further away from the sun, so I'm going to drop the exposure down a little bit as well. Brings out the magenta hue more in the sky. And also I'm going to drop the blacks down a little bit, and you'll just see the sky colour change a little bit darker in the corner here. Now I want to highlight this area here, so I'm going to take a radial filter and move it, and so it's covering a little bit more of the sea. And we're just going to bring the exposure up a tad, but not by much, and then what we do is we just get an emphasis on the shadows of the waves there. Now what I want to do is just make that a little bit more magenta, like that, and warm it up ever so slightly. I'm going to take another grad filter on the bottom here, just to darken the base of the image slightly. Just lead your eyeline a little bit further into the image. Post crop vignetting. Come down. Highlight priority. What we're going to do is we're going to drop this slider down to the left, and what it's going to do is going to bring you into the image and go that way. Ugh. Oh, we can go the correct way. Be subtle with this. If you go too far, it starts to become really noticeable. But if we can go to about -12, what it's done is it's just brought and darkened the outside of the image, but it's also brought this area into the shot a little bit more as well. Now I'm going to take my brush tool, and I'm going to be very subtle with this. All I'm going to do is just increase the exposure in these areas here, this area here, and also a little bit along here. Et voila. Now I could go to town on this and really work on areas and increase exposure in certain places, but it's not something that I do very much of at all, because again, this is how I shot it. So I've really done more than I would do normally. Now that might be a bad thing, that might be a good thing, but for me, I don't want to mess around with the image too much. Now, I've seen some brilliant post-production work where they'll highlight all this area here, they'll clean all this up and make it look more white, and it's absolutely awesome, but that's not how it looked when I took the picture. So let's look at it in full screen mode. There we go. That's looking okay. And I'm not going to mess around with it much more than that, other than spots. So there's something floating here. Highlight it. We're on Heal Tool. Lightroom will do its thing. Some blemishes here. Cool. Right, now we need to look for sensor spots. Visualize spots. Bring the slider over to the right. And I find that a better way to do this is if we go to 1:1, go to the corner of the image on the left hand side here, and we can start to see the blemishes in a little bit more detail. So we have one here, and it's not done a very good job of healing this blemish here, so we will delete that and we will have another go. That's better. And if we go to the left here and slowly scroll across, looking for dust spots on the sensor. So there may be one here, we'll get rid of that. So I'm not going to go to town on this because it's just for walkthrough purposes. So we go back to the image, and what I'm just going to show you here is, now that we've blended these two images together and worked on them in post-production, just how beautiful the dynamic range actually is. And we can just see how beautifully the colours and the textures are rendered after we've done the work. So if just go back to the full view, I'm happy with the overall image for purposes of this walkthrough. And if we compare it to the first image, we can see the improved definition and dynamic range of the rocks here on the left hand side. The reason we got this improved dynamic range is because we blended the two images together. And again, comparing the two images here, we can see the improved definition and the improved dynamic range on the hill there compared to this, which looks mushy. And also in the foreground of the rocks here, no definition, whereas we've got excellent definition and great dynamic range there on the left hand side. So if we just go into full view, I'm hoping that you'll agree that with not a lot of post-processing work at all, we've got quite an acceptable image there of a beautiful landmark in Anglesey. So I hope you enjoyed that walkthrough, just showing you how I use post-production in my images. I hope you enjoyed following me through my post-production workflow, and if you did, please subscribe. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great day.